Hi, my name is Ted, and if you don't subscribe to me already, please do. Hi, okay, listen, I recently started a Bible study with ChatGPT to see what I could learn from AI, artificial intelligence. I think we all know that by now. Anyway, I decided to start with the book of Romans. My original goal was to take this one chapter at a time, but instead I decided to see how different large language models would respond to my prompt. Now, for those of you who don't know what a large language model is, or LLM, they like to abbreviate everything. If you don't know what that is, well, it's like a chatbot. ChatGPT is the most popular one today, but not for the best study reasons. If you want to study, there's better, and I will direct you to Perplexity.ai. I'll tell you that later. I'll explain it later so you'll understand why I think this is important. Still, ChatGPT is really good despite some of its shortcomings. For this particular study, I chose 8 large language models. I use 7 of them a lot, but I included one other because I wanted to include all the big ones. And one of the companies, Microsoft, does put out a big one, which I got to make sure that I include them just to see how that one does as well. Anyway, I wanted to include all the big ones. And in order to get the best from each one, I created a detailed prompt to tell each one that they would be going to be teaching me, and they need to be in the teaching mode. You will see what I mean when I get into the same prompt that I gave to all 8 LLMs, large language models. So here's my breakdown of my prompt. I began with, I would like to start a discussion with the book of Romans. I then gave the large language model instructions and boundaries for our conversation. Number 1. For each prompt, I would like you to correct me or challenge me or let me know if it is correct. I need to learn. Number 2, don't always agree with me. But, number 3, look to peer-reviewed articles, books by reputable theologians and top theologians since the 1st century. Include biblical writers, historical writers as well, such as Josephus, Philo, Greek writers, pseudepigrapha, etc. Next, I established my level of knowledge. I do this so the large language model will know how best to dialogue with me. I'm already skilled in the Bible, and I've taught many years, but want to learn more. That's what I told the large language model. After giving the large language model what it needs to know about my level, I give it directions for AI role play. Role play is very important, and it's an important tool to use when you're learning. Role play is suggested by universities and developers of large language models. So first, I will tell the large language model what it will be. Then I define what I will be. For the following, I told the LLM, for the following, you will be the expert educator, and I will be your student, discussing with you. Finally, I gave the large language models boundaries for their answers. This is also important for setting up our discussion. Keep your answers short, I told them. Keep your answers short with one question for me, with each answer to stimulate our discussion. I have a hard time when a large language model gives me multiple questions at the end or during our discussion. So I almost always tell it to just give me one question at a time. I will be limiting my time with each chapter, I told the large language model. I will be limiting my time with each chapter, covering about 20 minutes for each chapter. Begin with Romans 1 by asking me one question. At this point, I didn't end up 20 minutes with each one, What I did is ended up just looking at 8 different first prompts, this one prompt. I didn't get any farther than that. If I were to be getting into a Bible study of my own and I really want to pursue it, I might choose one of these. Doesn't matter which one, they all came up with really good questions and really good challenging questions for me. So I don't know, I might just pick one like ChatGPT or Perplexity and go with that through. And, after it poses the question for me, I answer it and then it moves on. And it's moving me on. It's meeting me where I'm at. Now, answering my prompt, ChatGPT quoted verse 1 where Paul calls himself a servant of Jesus and an apostle for the gospel. ChatGPT then asked how his self-description and his identity set the stage for the entire book.
Great, let's begin. Romans 1 opens with Paul describing himself as a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. Question: why do you think Paul emphasizes his identity as both servant, slave, and apostle at the very start? And how does that shape the authority of what follows in Romans?
Le chat, which means the cat in French, is a French version of ChatGPT with minor differences. Like ChatGPT, Le chat focused on Paul's self-identity, calling himself a servant and an apostle. But whereas ChatGPT directed us to how these two identities relate to the entire book, Le chat turned me to Isaiah's suffering servant, I should say, as the basis of Paul's thinking.
Question for you. In Romans 1:1-7, Paul introduces himself as a servant of Christ Jesus and called to be an apostle. How does his use of the term servant, doulos in Greek, here connect to the Old Testament concept of servanthood, especially in light of Isaiah's servant songs, e.g. Isaiah 42:1-4, 49:1-6, 52:13-53:12? Do you see Paul intentionally framing his apostolic mission in terms of Israel's servant role? And if so, what might be the theological implications for his Gentile audience in Rome?
I found the suffering servant question interesting, as I never connected Paul's identity to the suffering servant in Isaiah. For me, the suffering servant was perhaps Jeremiah, then Israel, then Jesus. But I can see that in almost every letter he wrote, Paul identified himself as a servant of Jesus Christ. And while I wonder if it's possible for us to understand what was in the mind of Paul, I do see some possible reflections, perhaps secondary reflections, of the suffering servants in the letters that he wrote. Perplexity.ai followed Le chat in a lot of ways. The only difference I saw was that it gave me 29 sources. This is why I like Perplexity. Perplexity seeks to avoid the black boxes that ChatGPT and so many other large language models create. What are black boxes? They are answers given to you in which no one knows how AI came up with the response. Perplexity seeks to limit those black boxes, and one of the ways that it does this is by giving us the sources it uses.
Question for you. In Romans 1:1-7, Paul introduces himself as a servant of Christ Jesus and called to be an apostle. How does his use of the term servant, doulos in Greek, here connect to the Old Testament concept of servanthood, especially in light of Isaiah's servant songs, e.g. Isaiah 42:1-4, 49:1-6, 52:13-53:12? Do you see Paul intentionally framing his apostolic mission in terms of Israel's servant role? And if so, what might be the theological implications for his Gentile audience in Rome?
Both Le chat and Perplexity end with an interesting question. The suffering servant in Jeremiah refers to Israel, Jeremiah, and to Jesus. But these two AI chatbots ask us how the Gentiles would have viewed this in Paul's identity. Well, personally, I don't think most of them would have, Gentiles that is, most of them would have connected Jeremiah to Paul's usage of the word servant. In reality, I think they would be thinking of the hierarchy of what was in their day, where servants were very low in status, and their jobs were really to serve other people who were more important than them. Microsoft Copilot quoted verse 1, but then it added verse 2, and then it focused on that verse rather than verse 1. In fact, it completely ignored verse 1.
Excellent. Let's begin with Romans 1. Paul opens by identifying himself as a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. This gospel, he says, was promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. Question 1. Do you interpret Paul's phrase, promised beforehand through his prophets, as referring primarily to messianic prophecies? Or does it encompass broader themes like covenant, exile, and restoration?
Again, this was another great question. I do see that Paul's writings focus a lot on covenant, exile, restoration, so it seems that this might be included. What do you think? Gemini is Google's large language model. And when I asked Gemini to work with me on Romans chapter 1, it patted me on the back for having such an extensive background. Honestly, I'm not a fan of this kind of stuff when the large language models pat you on the back and tell you how wonderful you are, how right you are, and stuff like that. I didn't see much of this going on in other models today. I do see them a lot other days, but not today. But today I saw it in Gemini, and that was the only model that really brought this out.
Welcome to our discussion on the book of Romans. Given your extensive background, I'm confident this will be a fruitful exploration for both of us. Let's begin with Romans chapter 1. The Apostle Paul introduces himself and his purpose in the opening verses. To start our discussion, please tell me, what do you see as the main purpose of Paul's introduction in Romans 1:1-7?
Gemini moved quickly past the earlier verses and asked another great question, which was about finding the purpose of all the verses from 1 through 7. Elon Musk's Grok had the shortest response to my prompt. It looked at all the verses from 1 through 17 and then asked how these verses set the stage for chapter 1.
What do you see as the main theme introduced in Romans 1:1-17? And how does it set the stage for Paul's argument in the rest of the chapter?
The only response I could give Grok is this. When Paul wrote Romans, there was no chapter 1, 2, 3, or any other chapter. Chapters and verses were added 1,200, 1,500 years later. So restricting the influence of 1 through 17 to chapter 1 is restricting the search to an artificial fence surrounding a passage placed in a larger setting. Did you get all that? It's like putting this artificial fence around a certain section. It's not necessarily the type of fence that Paul would have created because there were no chapters and verses that he wrote down. Anyway, let's move on. So this married couple used to work for ChatGPT's OpenAI. OpenAI is the company. And they started another company because they believed it would be safer than OpenAI. And they called their large language model Claude. Now, I don't know where they get the word Claude. I should look it up sometime. Anyway, when I sent my prompt to Claude, it went straight to verses 16 and 17. And then it ignored all the earlier verses.
Let me start our study of Romans 1 with a foundational question that gets to the heart of Paul's argument. In Romans 1:16-17, Paul declares the gospel is the power of God for salvation and connects this to the righteousness of God being revealed. How do you understand the phrase righteousness of God, dikaiosune theou, in this context? Is Paul referring to God's own righteousness as an attribute or something else entirely? This interpretation has significant implications for how we read the rest of the letter, so I'm curious about your take on this crucial phrase that sets up Paul's entire theological argument.
I like Claude's focus on the righteousness of God because it's central to the entire book of Romans. So I will admit that even though these other large language models have great questions and may have eventually gotten to this with future questions, Claude, I liked, got to the core of the book right away. Finally, I asked Amazon's Meta. Meta moved directly to verses 18 through 32. The other large language models had me thinking in terms of context of the book, immediate context, the Old Testament theology in the book of Jeremiah. Meta alone directed me to a theological approach developed 2nd century perhaps, and refined ever since then.
Let's dive into Romans 1. Here's a question to get us started. In Romans 1:18-32, Paul describes the wrath of God being revealed against humanity's unrighteousness. What role do you think the concept of natural revelation plays in Paul's argument here, particularly in relation to Gentiles and God's judgment?
Now, it's been a great study, and I really was very pleasantly surprised at what I learned. And this is Ted. You all subscribe to me, please.